The quietest moments, Aiden had learned, often carried the loudest truths. He sat on the worn velvet couch, the low light of the table lamp casting long shadows across his apartment floor, watching his friend's mother examine a chipped porcelain cup. She didn't look up. She simply traced the rim with her thumb, a gesture that held more weight than a shouted argument. He knew what she saw, not the tiny flaw in the ceramic, but the invisible cracks running through his own life. If you believe some moments are too real, too important to be forgotten, you must see how this ends. Don't leave Aiden and Valerie's secret stranded here in the cold. Like, share, and make sure you stay until the very last frame. Hey dear, welcome to Hearts Entangled, a gentle corner for love, healing, and the quiet stories we rarely find the courage to voice. If soft, lingering tales about human connection mean something to you, then you're exactly where you belong. So before we dive in, do me a small kindness. Hit subscribe, tap the like button, and maybe hold something warm between your palms. This story wants you to feel with it, because today's story might be the reminder your heart didn't realize it was waiting for. Now, let's begin. Aiden was a man of lines and logic. At 28, living in his quiet corner of Portland, Oregon, his world was the clean architecture of code. He built apps, elegant, efficient, seamless for other people's dreams, retreating into the predictable sanctuary of his laptop screen. It was a life built not on passion, but on reliable income and the exquisite safety of working alone. He was a creature of habit, his days segmented by coding sprints, solo long-distance runs along the Willamette River, and nights spent with the only company he truly trusted: silence. It was this safety, this meticulous routine that had cost him his last relationship. "You're a ghost with a paycheck, Aiden," she'd said, her voice tired, not angry. "You let your code breathe more than you let me in." The words hadn't stung so much as simply confirmed what he already knew. His emotional life was a fortress, and he was the only guard. The woman sitting across from him now, though, was a challenge to those walls. Valerie, 48, was the mother of his best friend, Leo. He'd known her for years, but only in the context of holidays and Leo's birthday dinners. She was strikingly composed, with a quiet intensity that suggested she noticed everything without ever speaking a judgment. Where Aiden used silence to hide, Valerie seemed to wear it like a cloak of deep self-possession. Leo, in contrast, was an open book, a boisterous travel blogger with a laugh that could fill a stadium. Leo was perpetually pulling Aiden out of his solitude. "Look, it's not a retreat, it's a detox. 3 days in the Cascades, private lodge, fresh air, no signals. Mom's turning 49 and she deserves a proper family vibe birthday. Come on, man, I know your calendar is blank." The trip felt like a seismic disruption to Aiden's routine, but Leo was impossible to refuse. And perhaps a small reckless voice whispered he was ready for a little seismic activity. Now, hours after their arrival at the sprawling wood-beamed lodge in Washington state, Aiden felt the old tension return. Leo was already outside with a half-dozen friends, their shouts and music disrupting the peaceful mountain air. Aiden found himself retreating to a quiet corner of the lodge, nursing a lukewarm coffee. He watched Valerie across the room, sitting by a massive stone fireplace. She wasn't reading, she was simply watching the fire, the flickering light catching the deep green of her eyes. She wore a thick, dark coat, and around her neck a bright crimson scarf that seemed almost aggressively vibrant against the neutral tones of the lodge. Aiden felt a subtle, almost magnetic pull towards her quietness. It wasn't a romantic feeling, it was the recognition of a shared instinct for solitude in a crowd. He finally walked over, not sure what he intended to say. He simply sat down in the chair opposite hers. "Too much noise?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Valerie lifted her eyes from the flames. She gave him a faint smile, the kind that was reserved and honest, without the forced cheer of social obligation. "Noise is easier to handle than silence, sometimes," she replied, her voice low and textured, like a cello string. "Most people are afraid of what their own quiet will tell them." Her words hung there, striking him with unexpected accuracy. Valerie had a background, he knew, that gave her a different relationship with quiet. Leo had once mentioned that before she ran an online history archive, she had been an investigative journalist covering conflict zones. It was a history that explained the depth in her eyes and the armor of her composure. "I'm used to my own quiet," Aiden admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "I choose it." "Do you, though?" she countered gently, finally picking up her coffee cup. "Or do you just manage the fear of being seen?" It was a soft blow, but it landed true. Aiden didn't have an answer. He merely nodded, recognizing the profound difference between choosing solitude and creating walls. The fire crackled, a warm, honest sound. The noise from outside seemed to recede, leaving just the two of them in a pocket of deep, unspoken understanding. It was the most honest he had felt all year. "I think I need some air," Aiden said finally, rising. "I saw a small, marked loop trail outside the lodge. Nothing strenuous." Valerie stood up too, slowly, tucking her crimson scarf inside her coat collar. "I'll join you," she said, her expression changing, losing the heavy weight of introspection. "I'd rather walk than endure a forced celebration." Aiden felt a peculiar lift in his chest, a gentle anticipation. He hadn't expected company, but the idea of sharing the silence with Valerie felt safer, more grounding than facing his own apartment again. The chapter ends as they step out of the lodge, the sharp, cold air of the Cascades hitting their faces like a bracing slap. The low winter sun was still bright, glinting off the vast, pristine fields of snow. The path started easily, wide and well-trodden, marked by small painted wooden posts. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the snow crunching musically beneath their boots, the scent of pine and crisp cold filling Aiden's lungs. It was an honest air, clean and bracing, a relief after the recycled air of his Portland apartment. Aiden was surprised by the ease of the companionship. They spoke in fragments, asking about work. He detailed the logic of coding, she described the nuance of digging for hidden histories in digital archives. It was the kind of conversation two mature people share when they are simply passing time, light, respectful, and undemanding. "You come up here often with Leo?" Aiden asked, stepping over a small frozen root. "Every year since he was a teenager," Valerie confirmed, her eyes scanning the vast, silent trees. "It was our way of keeping things going after his father passed. A ritual." Her voice softened on the last word, suggesting a depth of meaning she didn't elaborate on, and Aiden knew not to push. He glanced at her. The crimson scarf was a bold splash of color against the white and dark landscape, a vibrant focal point in the quiet palette of the forest. He realized how rarely he saw her outside the domestic context of being Leo's mom. Out here, surrounded by the silent giants of the trees, she was simply Valerie, a beautiful, complicated woman walking beside him. Then the sky began to change. It wasn't a slow shift. It happened with a speed that felt aggressive, almost hostile. The clear blue dome above them turned a heavy, bruised gray, and a soft flurry of snow began. "We should probably turn back," Aiden said, zipping his jacket higher, squinting at the thickening air. He'd seen enough nature documentaries to know how fast mountain weather could turn. Valerie nodded immediately. "Agreed." But when they turned, the world had already been swallowed. In just a few minutes, the soft flurry had become a blinding whiteout. Heavy, wet sheets of snow were falling, covering the ground and erasing all trace of their path. The wooden trail markers they'd passed minutes before were now invisible, buried beneath a rapidly accumulating layer of powder. A cold knot tightened in Aiden's stomach. He pulled out his phone. 10% battery remaining. 0 signal bars. "Shit," he muttered, flicking on the weak flashlight. Valerie stood utterly still, her hands pushed deep into her pockets. Her composure, however, was still intact, lending a strange calm to the chaos. "We'll find the path," she said, her voice steady, but Aiden heard the faint metallic edge of tension underneath. They pushed forward for another 20 minutes, Aiden using the phone light to try and spot anything familiar. The trees looked identical in every direction. The snow came down relentlessly, turning the forest into a claustrophobic maze of white and shadow. "Lucas, slow down," Valerie's voice cut through the whine of the wind, sharper than before. Aiden stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath ragged. He looked at her, his vision blurring slightly from the cold and the fear. "We're just going in circles," she stated, her green eyes narrowed, focused like a camera lens trying to find definition in the chaos. He felt the panic rising, hot and ugly. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, hiding the shaking in his hands. "I'm sorry," he managed, the words rough in his throat. "I shouldn't have suggested this walk." He braced for the expected snap, the blame. But she simply shook her head, brushing snow off her sleeve. "It's not your fault, Aiden. Storms like this don't ask permission up here." Her tone was calm, but he saw the pale line of her lips and the way she was clutching her hands inside her pockets. She was colder than she was letting on. They continued to trudge, every step sinking deeper, requiring massive effort. His lungs stung, his mind raced with terrifying images of being stuck outside all night. "You okay?" he asked, Valerie, slowing his pace to match hers. She nodded, but he caught a slight wince as her boots sank awkwardly into the powder, catching a hidden root. "Just keep going," she urged, but the usual steady confidence in her voice was replaced by a visible tremor. After what felt like an hour of agonizing, aimless effort, Aiden stopped. He was defeated. "This isn't working," he admitted, his voice ragged. Valerie stepped closer, her gloved hand landing lightly but firmly on his shoulder. It was an anchor in the storm. "Aiden, stop," she said, her voice low but piercing through his spiral. "You're panicking, and it's making me panic too. We need to think." He looked at her then, truly seeing her outside her role. Her hood had slipped back and snow clung to her brown hair, melting onto her forehead. Her cheeks were flushed raw by the cold. Her eyes were wide, but not scared, just intensely focused, the way a person looks when they are sizing up mortal danger. But there was something else too. Her hand was trembling, slightly, and her lips were pressed tight, a raw vulnerability that she was trying desperately to hide. In that moment, she was no longer the composed older woman he knew. She was just Valerie, stuck out here with him, fighting to survive. "Okay," Aiden whispered, forcing a slow, deliberate breath. "What do we do?" "Shelter," she replied instantly, scanning the tree line, the breath puffing white from her lips. "We keep wondering we'll die of exposure. We need to find anything, a cave, a hollow, a structure." He swallowed the knot in his throat. She was right. He reached out almost without thinking and enclosed her gloved hand in his. "Downhill it is," he said, the words a commitment. Her fingers tightened around his for a second, a fleeting, electric connection, and in that small, shared gesture, the biting cold of the mountain felt a little less sharp. They pushed on, leaning into the slope, the snow piling higher around their knees. The last of the daylight disappeared, leaving them in a world of whispering wind and deep gray darkness. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Valerie pointed ahead. "There," she rasped, relief sharp in her voice. Against the ghostly shapes of the pines, Aiden saw a faint outline, a low, dark structure, barely more than a shed, but undeniably a building. It was their only shot. The small, weathered structure was a fire warden's shack, grayed by years of sun and snow, barely visible against the pines. It was a humble, forgotten place, yet to Aiden and Valerie it glowed like a beacon of impossible hope. Snow had drifted high against the entrance, and Aiden had to put his shoulder against the door, leaning his full weight into it until the old wood groaned in protest and finally gave way. The smell that greeted them was of damp wood, mildew, and old dust, but it was dry air, and more importantly, it was still air. The wind, which had been a physical weapon outside, was instantly reduced to a harmless moan against the thin walls. Aiden stumbled in, his boots scraping the rough floor, Valerie close behind him. "This will do," Valerie said, her voice steady but laced with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He could see her shivering now, a deep tremor that ran through her frame. The crimson scarf was crusted with ice, and her hands, still encased in sodden gloves, remained shoved deep in her pockets, hoarding the last remnants of her own heat. Aiden took a quick, desperate inventory with the last fading flicker of his phone's light before the screen died completely. The room was sparse, a testament to pure function. A rusty wood stove stood sentinel in one corner. A single narrow wooden bench lined one wall. A shelf held a few dusty, unlabeled cans, and, miraculously, there was a crate piled with folded wool blankets beside a small stack of kindling and a box of matches. "Thank God," Aiden breathed, the words escaping as a cloud of vapor. His fingers were stiff, clumsy, and agonizingly cold, but he knew exactly what needed to happen next. "Let's get this fire going." Valerie set her thermos on the bench, moving slowly, deliberately, like every joint was frozen. She began shaking the snow from her dark coat, the effort draining her last reserves of strength. Aiden knelt by the stove, fumbling with the matches. His first 2 attempts failed, the tiny flames snuffed out by the damp chill of the room. The 3rd match caught, the sulfur scent sharp in the air, and he protected the fragile spark with his body until the kindling finally accepted the flame with a soft, hungry crackle. Soon the fire was established, licking greedily at the dry wood, casting a warm, flickering glow that pushed back the overwhelming darkness and the cold that had settled into their bones. The heat was not just physical, it felt like a psychological victory. Aiden looked up at Valerie. She was peeling off her wet gloves, her hair damp, clinging to her cheeks. Her lips were still pale, but she managed a small, genuine smile, a smile that reached her eyes. "Not bad, Aiden," she said, her voice softer now, less strained. "You're handy in a crisis. The coder comes through." Aiden managed a rough chuckle, the sound raw in his throat. "I'll survive. You, though," I paused, grabbing 2 blankets from the crate and handing one to her. "I'm worried about the frostbite potential of that scarf." She draped the wool over her shoulders, the melted snow on her coat forming dark, expanding patches. He sat down next to her on the narrow bench, close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. The fire snapped, filling the silence, and for a long moment, they simply sat, allowing the heat to sink in, catching their breath. Valerie eventually opened one of the dusty cans, scraping away rust before looking at the faded label. "Beef stew. Expiration date? Last millennium, perhaps. Gourmet?" Aiden's tension eased enough for a real laugh. "I've had worse server crashes. We share." They ate the thick, cold stew, passing the can back and forth with a couple of rusty spoons they found on the shelf, washing it down with the remaining cold coffee from Valerie's thermos. It was meager, unappetizing, but it was sustenance, and the sharing of it stripped away another layer of formality. As the fire steadied and the small shack grew warmer, Valerie leaned back against the wall, her blanket pulled tight. The wind continued its mournful shriek outside, rattling the window pane, but inside, they were sheltered. "Leo and I used to come up here every winter," she began, her voice quiet, almost a thought escaping rather than a confession. "After his dad died, Afghanistan. Leo was 15. Aiden remained perfectly still, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He hadn't known the details, only the fact of the loss. "This trip," she continued, staring into the mesmerizing dance of the flames, her fingers tracing the metal rim of the thermos. "It was our ritual, our way of keeping things together. Like if we kept doing this, we could pretend the family wasn't broken, that everything was still whole." She paused, the weight of a decade of grief suddenly palpable in the dusty air. "I didn't realize how much I was pretending too." Her words hung heavy, resonant with something Aiden couldn't quite name, a profound, lingering sorrow. He shifted closer, his knee brushing hers under the blanket. "He didn't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "About his dad, any of it." Valerie turned her green eyes to him, and in that firelight, he saw a shocking depth of vulnerability, raw, entirely unguarded. "Most people don't," she said simply. "I learned to keep moving, easier than stopping." Aiden reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, then placed his hand over hers where it rested on the thermos. Her skin was still cool, trembling slightly, but he didn't pull away. He simply held the contact, firm and steady. "You don't have to keep moving right now," he said, his voice quieted by the sheer intimacy of the moment. She didn't flinch, didn't pull back. Instead, her fingers curled slightly under his, accepting the anchoring touch. She let out a long, slow breath. "Thank you, Aiden, for being here." He pulled off his own jacket, damp but still warm from his body, and draped it over her shoulders, augmenting the blanket. She looked at him, surprised, then a faint, true smile curved her lips. "You're going to freeze," she said, though the protest was gentle, almost affectionate. He shrugged, trying to play it off, the action covering the fierce protectiveness that had flared in his chest. "I'll survive." But inside, his chest was tight, not from the returning cold, but from the way she was looking at him. Not as Leo's friend, not as the resourceful stranger, but as someone who mattered, someone who was actively choosing to share her survival with him. The fire crackled, the wind screamed its impotent rage outside, and the space between them shrank until it seemed to vanish entirely. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that this was no longer about merely staying warm. The fire settled into a steady, reliable core of heat, the glow pushing the shadows into the farthest corners of the little shack. Outside, the world was consumed by the howling wind, but inside, the air was thick, charged with the unsaid. Valerie and Aiden sat close, their knees occasionally brushing under the shared wool blanket, his jacket still draped over her shoulders. The hand she had offered earlier, resting against the thermos, was now warm, the tremor finally gone, settled under his own. The silence they shared was no longer empty or fearful, it was full, holding something immense that neither dared to name. Aiden looked at her. The firelight played across the curve of her cheek, illuminating the damp strands of her brown hair curling softly against her neck. She was staring deep into the flames, her green eyes distant, lost in a landscape of memory. "You okay?" he asked, his voice a low, careful murmur, afraid to break the fragile atmosphere they had built. She blinked, turning to him slowly, and for a fleeting, unguarded second, the wall she kept around herself was gone. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I haven't stopped to think about that in a very, very long time." She shifted, leaning her shoulder infinitesimally closer to his, and the blanket slipped down. Aiden reached out to pull it back up, his fingers briefly, accidentally grazing her neck. She didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned into the touch, just enough for him to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "When I was a journalist," she began, the words slow and deliberate, "I saw things most people don't. Bombs, bodies, people who'd lost everything. I learned to keep moving, keep documenting, because if I stopped, the grief, the horror, it would swallow me whole." She paused, the weight of her history momentarily resting on him. "And when Leo's dad died, I kept moving for him, for us. But somewhere along the way, I think I forgot how to stop, how to just be." Her words struck Aiden with a force that surpassed the physical impact of the storm. He had always seen her as an unbreakable tower of strength, the one who held it all together. But here, in this frozen, remote cabin, she was simply Valerie, a woman who had been carrying an unbearable load for far too long. He tightened his grip on her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her pain, an offering of support that felt more real than any code he had ever written. "You don't have to keep it together now," he urged, his voice rough with sincerity. "Not here, not with me." She turned fully to face him, her eyes searching his, and the air between them shifted completely, like a door creaking open to a place neither had intended to enter. "Aiden," she said, her voice softer now, almost fragile, "if this is the last night, if we're stuck here, if this is all we get." She looked away for a beat, gathering her courage, before meeting his gaze again. "I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to be Leo's mom, or the strong one, or the one who's always fine. I just want to be me, a woman, someone who's still here, still alive." Her words hung in the air, a raw, unguarded plea. Aiden could see the years of carefully managed trauma, the profound, agonizing longing to be recognized for the person she truly was, stripped of all her prescribed roles. "I see you," he said, the words spilling out before logic could intercept them. Her breath hitched, a small, involuntary sound. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire settled, the wind outside screamed its fury, but their world narrowed to the confines of the small, warm shack, this moment, this truth. He didn't know who initiated the contact. Perhaps it was the magnetic force of their shared need, but their faces were suddenly closer, her breath warm against his cheek. Her eyes held his, steady, vulnerable, and yielding. And then her lips brushed his. It was soft at first, hesitant, a quiet testing of the boundary. Then it deepened, slow, deliberate, an eloquent conversation that bypassed language entirely. It was a kiss that communicated everything the storm had ripped away and everything they needed to reclaim. Her hand slid up his arm, resting on his shoulder, and Aiden pulled her closer, the blankets falling forgotten to the floor. It wasn't about desperation or heat. It was a profound connection. Two isolated souls finding something undeniably real in the absolute center of a terrifying crisis. Her lips were warm, carrying the faint metallic taste of the canned stew and coffee. For those precious seconds, the cold, the fear, the roaring world outside ceased to exist. It was just them, tangled in a quiet, necessary truth. They pulled back, resting their foreheads together, their breaths mixing in the dim light. "Aiden," she whispered, her voice trembling now, but not from the cold. "I haven't felt this alive in years." He simply held her, his hand resting gently on the back of her neck, feeling the dampness of her hair. "Me neither," he managed, his voice barely audible. He realized then that he had been just as lost as she was, not in the snow, but in his own coded life, hiding behind a wall of safety. But here, with her, he wasn't hiding anymore. They didn't speak much after that. The fire burned steady, casting its long, flickering shadows, and they sat closer than before, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. The storm outside no longer felt heavy. For the first time in a very long time, Aiden did not feel alone. The fire in the fire warden's shack had finally settled into a deep, steady glow, its warmth a tangible presence that fought back the persistent chill of the Washington Cascades. Aiden and Valerie remained exactly where they had fallen asleep, tangled together in the heavy wool blankets, their shoulders pressed against the hard wooden bench. Her head was tucked against his shoulder, her breath rising and falling with a soft, comforting rhythm. The kiss, the shared vulnerability, the profound quiet of the night, it all lingered in the air, a beautiful, fragile truth suspended between them. Aiden didn't move, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace. For the first time since he could remember, he wasn't thinking about a deadline, a runtime, or a firewall. He was simply existing, grounded by the weight of her body against his. This closeness was not born of convenience, but of necessity, of a shared, desperate need to feel something real. He watched the embers shift, the light catching the faint rise and fall of Valerie's chest. He felt protective, fiercely so. She had been the strong one for so long, the composed keeper of the family's grief, the professional who navigated conflict and trauma. Now, stripped of those roles by the mountain, she was simply a person who needed warmth, rest, and safety. He pulled the blanket tighter around them, his arm draped possessively over her shoulder, and she subconsciously curled deeper into him. It was a silent conversation, a comfort that surpassed any words they had spoken. He drifted in and out of a light, uneasy sleep, the cold occasionally creeping in to remind him where they were. At one point, closer to the pre-dawn hours, he woke completely, his neck stiff. Valerie stirred too, her eyes fluttering open, and for a silent, profound moment, they simply looked at each other in the dim, fiery light. "You're still here?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep and wonder. "Yeah," Aiden whispered softly, his own voice rusty. "Not going anywhere." She gave a small, contented nod, a soft smile curving her lips, and closed her eyes again, trusting his presence. They talked in quiet fragments as the night wore on. Valerie spoke of her work, not the conflict zones, but the quiet, human moments she had captured in the periphery. She described a photograph she'd taken in a desert camp halfway across the world years ago, a lone soldier holding a crinkled letter from home, his face lit by a single candle. "It was the only time I cried on assignment," she confessed, her voice barely audible. Not because it was sad, but because it was so utterly human. It proved that underneath all the armor, there was still a heart beating for a simple life. Aiden, in turn, found himself sharing secrets he had never voiced, even to Leo. He told her about the time he stayed up for 48 hours straight, coding a complex e-commerce site for a client, only to realize he had built something beautiful, something he was actually proud of, something that felt mine. "I don't tell people about that," he admitted, resting his chin on her head. "It feels too small, too self-important." She shook her head, her hand resting against his bicep. "Nothing small if it matters to you. That's what keeps you human." The hours passed in that profound intimacy, quiet exchanges, long stretches of silence that felt comfortable, meaningful, and utterly non-judgmental. Then, just as the sky outside began to fade from absolute black to a faint, cold gray, a new sound intruded. Aiden heard it first, a low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump in the distance, growing louder, more insistent. A helicopter. His heart leaped, a mix of sheer relief and a sudden sharp twist of regret. The intrusion meant the end of their bubble. Valerie stirred, lifting her head quickly, her eyes blinking open against the faint dawn light seeping through the tiny window. "They found us," she said, her voice soft but steady. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her, and they stared at each other. The weight of what had happened, the kiss, the confessions, the shared survival, settled heavily between them. The helicopter's roar grew louder, and they could hear faint, muffled shouts cutting through the wind. Aiden stood, his muscles stiff, and helped her up. Her hand lingered in his, warm and firm, and she squeezed it once, hard, before letting go. The silent gesture spoke volumes. This was real. "Thank you, Aiden," she said, her eyes meeting his, steady but suddenly unreadable again. "For last night." He felt the words stick in his throat. "You don't have to thank me," he said finally. "I'm glad it was us." She nodded, her lips pressed into a small, wistful smile. And then she began to gather her things, her thermos, her coat, her crimson scarf. As she adjusted the wool around her neck, the familiar armor seemed to click back into place. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the outside world rushing in to reclaim them. They pushed the door open, the cold air hitting them with the force of a physical blow. The helicopter's lights flashed brightly in the distance, and they could see figures moving toward them, their voices urgent. Valerie's hand brushed Aiden's one last time, a fleeting, almost electric contact, before she stepped forward, her red scarf a vibrant splash against the snow, ready to meet the world again. He followed, his heart heavy, knowing the most dangerous part of the journey was not the storm they had survived, but the return to their separate lives. The helicopter's noise filled the air, deafening and immediate, obliterating the quiet intimacy of the cabin. As they stepped out into the bright, silent landscape of the dawn, Aiden felt the cold seize his lungs. He watched Valerie, her shoulders squared, her pace measured, already pulling herself back into the role of the composed survivor. The crimson scarf was tied neatly, a stark, beautiful detail against the white, yet it felt like a boundary line, separating her cabin self from her public self. A ranger in a bright orange jacket waved them over. Then Aiden saw Leo. His friend stumbled through the snow, his face pale and frantic with relief, immediately wrapping Valerie in a tight, shaking hug. "Mom, thank God," Leo choked out, his voice cracking with genuine fear. Then he turned to Aiden, grabbing his shoulder, his eyes wet. "Aiden, man, I thought—" He didn't finish the thought, just pulled him into a quick, rough hug. They were bundled into the helicopter, wrapped in thermal blankets. Valerie sat across from Aiden. She looked calm, almost detached, fielding Leo's barrage of anxious questions with practiced ease. When their eyes met across the tight space, there was only a split second, a flicker where Aiden saw the vulnerability, the hidden truth they shared. She squeezed his hand once, so quickly it could have been a nervous tick, then let go, turning back to her son. "We're fine," she said, her voice steady. "Just got lost. Aiden kept us together." Leo clapped Aiden's back, grinning with relief. "You're a hero, man." Aiden forced a smile, but the word felt wrong. Hero wasn't the currency of their night. Truth and need were. Back at the lodge, the chaos was immediate. Paramedics, coffee, crowds of concerned friends and staff. Valerie was across the room, talking to a ranger, her posture straight, her smile polite, every inch the contained, untouchable woman she had been when they arrived. Aiden wanted desperately to catch her eye, to share a moment of private acknowledgement, but she never looked his way. They left the Cascades the next day, the group subdued. Leo drove, attempting to inject energy into the car with a loud playlist, but Aiden barely heard it, staring out the window at the mountains receding into the distance. Valerie sat in the passenger seat, her thermos in her lap, answering Leo's attempts at chatter with short, warm, but impenetrable responses. Aiden tried to act normal, but every time he glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, his stomach twisted with a profound ache. The night in the cabin had changed him. It had broken his walls, and he knew it had cracked hers. Back in Portland, life snapped back to its old rhythm, but the rhythm was wrong. His apartment felt sterile, his code meaningless. A few days later, he sent Valerie a simple text, "You okay?" No reply. A week later, he tried again. Coffee? Maybe talk? Silence. He told himself she was busy, that the moment was a product of crisis, a survival mechanism. But the silence stung like a betrayal. He began to second-guess everything, the kiss, the confessions, the look in her eyes. Maybe he had read it all wrong. A month later, Leo invited him over to watch a football game. This was his chance. When Aiden arrived at the house, Leo was sprawled on the couch. "Mom's out," Leo said, not looking up from the screen. Aiden nodded, masking his sharp disappointment, and sank onto the couch. Then he saw it. On the wall, above the fireplace, a new photograph was framed. It was a professional, large print, a snowy forest, the pines heavy with powder, beautiful and desolate. In the center of the frame, stark against the brilliant white, was a single, vibrant detail, a crimson scarf draped over a bare, twisted branch. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. That was their forest, their night, captured and immortalized in a way only she, the former journalist, could do. The scarf was her unmistakable signature, a silent testament. Aiden stared at the image, his chest seizing with a painful yet beautiful clarity. "Yo, Aiden, you good?" Leo's voice cut through the silence. "You're staring at that picture like it's gonna talk." Aiden forced a dry laugh. "Just didn't know your mom was into photography like that." Leo shrugged. "Yeah, she's weirdly good at it. She took that last month, said it was the most important picture she'd taken in years." Aiden stayed for the game, but he saw nothing but snow and red. As he left, Leo called after him. "Hey, you sure you're okay? You've been weird since the trip." "Yeah," Aiden replied, his voice steady. "Just tired." But as he walked to his car, the full, crushing weight of Plot Twist 2 settled over him. Valerie hadn't forgotten. She hadn't moved on. She had simply chosen to take their secret, their fragile moment of truth, and turn it into art, a beautiful, haunting echo she could keep forever without risking the upheaval of their real lives. He hadn't been invited back into her life, but he had been included in her greatest, most hidden truth. The scarf was the answer. He drove back to his apartment, the ache in his chest not the dull pain of loneliness, but the specific, sharp sting of a shared memory that would never fade. He was alone, yes, but he was no longer walled off. He was simply living with a love that existed only in silence, preserved perfectly in a single crimson photograph.